Feel your own weight pressing down through a single joint no wider than your hand, again and again, with every step you take today. Every four-legged animal spreads that same load across four sturdy legs. But somewhere along the long shift towards standing upright, the human knee was left carrying that task alone. What kind of mechanical bet did evolution make when it built a body balanced on two narrow hinges instead of four? Why do human knees wear out in a way no four-legged animals ever do? Feel the weight of your own body gather into a single point beneath you with each step forward, rising up through the ankle and settling, briefly and completely, into a joint no wider than the palm of a hand, and notice that in this instant there is no second leg quietly absorbing part of that load. No companion limb pressing into the ground beside it, only one hinge holding the entire structure upright while the other leg swings loose through open air before landing again in its turn. This rhythm feels ordinary because it has always been the only way a human body knows how to move, yet it marks something genuinely unusual among land animals that carry their own weight on legs. Picture, instead, an animal standing on four legs at rest, its trunk suspended like a tabletop resting on four separate columns, none of which needs to hold the full weight alone at any single moment. And even while that same animal is walking, at least two of its four legs generally remain in contact with the ground together, sharing the load between them in a continuous, overlapping rhythm. A body built this way rarely asks a single joint to carry everything alone. The human walking stride breaks that pattern entirely. During the portion of each step researchers often call the swing phase, one leg lifts fully off the ground while the other becomes, for that fraction of a second, the only point of contact between the entire body and the earth beneath it, meaning the full weight of the trunk, arms, head, and everything carried within that frame funnels down through one ankle and one knee with no second column standing by to help. This shift did not arrive suddenly, and it did not arrive without consequence. It traces back to a long transition among our early ancestors, a slow rearrangement of the skeleton that began when a lineage moving mostly on four limbs, often supported partly by the arms while climbing and moving through trees, started instead to rely on the hind limbs alone for getting around on the ground. Once that transition took hold, the center of gravity of the whole body no longer sat low and stable between 4 points of contact but rose high above a narrow base formed by just 2 feet, and every joint along the leg had to be reshaped to keep that tall, narrow structure from toppling with each stride. The hip changed shape to bear weight from a new angle. The pelvis widened into something more basin-like to support the organs above it. The spine developed its familiar curves to keep the head balanced over the hips rather than out in front of them. But it is the knee that ended up absorbing the sharpest consequence of this rearrangement, because the knee sits at the exact point where two very different demands meet inside a single joint. Consider what the knee is actually being asked to do with each stride. It has to bend and straighten cleanly, the way a simple door hinge opens and closes along one flat plane, so the leg can swing forward and extend to strike the ground again. That much a hinge alone could manage. But the human leg is not built as one straight column running down from hip to foot. Because the two hip joints sit relatively far apart, while the feet must land close together beneath the body's narrow base to keep balance while walking, the thigh bone actually angles inward as it descends from hip to knee, meaning the knee has to correct for that inward angle and still deliver a foot that lands pointed straight ahead, aligned properly beneath a shifting center of mass. To manage that correction, the knee cannot simply flex and extend like a door. It also has to allow a small amount of rotation, a subtle twisting motion layered on top of the hinge motion, so the lower leg can adjust its alignment moment to moment as weight shifts from one side of the body to the other with every step. This is the quiet complexity hiding inside an ordinary walk. The knee is not one simple mechanism doing one simple job. It is a hinge and a rotating platform combined into a single joint, asked to perform both roles at once, under the full weight of the body, with no second leg sharing the burden during that critical instant of single leg support. Now picture, again, the four-legged animal from earlier, moving across open ground on its own four limbs. Its knee, sometimes called a stifle joint by those who study animal movement, still bends and straightens with each stride, but it is rarely asked to correct for the same kind of side-to-side balancing act, Because the animal's trunk is slung low and wide between 4 columns rather than balanced narrowly above 2, small shifts in alignment can be absorbed by the whole 4-legged frame working together, spread across multiple joints and multiple limbs, rather than concentrated into the rotating twist of a single knee holding up the entire body alone. In other words, the same mechanical problem that the human knee must solve internally through its own combined hinge and rotation design, a 4-legged body solves externally through the geometry of having 4 separate points of contact with the ground instead of 2. 2 very different engineering solutions to the same basic challenge of moving a body across solid ground, and only one of them concentrates so much responsibility into a joint roughly the size of a fist. There is a second layer to this same imbalance, one that has nothing to do with bending or rotating and everything to do with simply staying in place sideways. A 4-legged frame resists being pushed from the side almost by its own shape, because a push toward one flank meets resistance from legs planted on the opposite side of the body, the same way a low, wide table barely wobbles no matter which direction someone leans against it. A body balanced on a single narrow column of support has no such built-in resistance waiting on the other side. When a foot lands slightly off-center, on a root, a stone, a patch of uneven ground, something inside that one leg has to resist the sideways pull entirely on its own, with no opposite limb bracing against the same force from the other direction. That resistance falls largely to a set of tough, fibrous bands wrapped around the sides and through the center of the knee, tissue built specifically to hold the joint from sliding or buckling sideways under exactly this kind of unbalanced load. These bands are not designed to move the leg the way muscle does. Their entire purpose is to hold a line, to keep the joint from drifting past the narrow range it can safely bend and twist within, and they carry out that job silently, tensioning and releasing with every uneven step, long before any sensation of strain ever reaches conscious awareness. In a 4-legged body, this stabilizing work is shared out across the whole frame, distributed among several limbs bracing together against the ground. In a 2-legged body walking on open, unpredictable terrain, that same stabilizing work collapses down into these few bands of tissue inside one joint, tissue that must hold firm on every single step across a lifetime of uneven surfaces, sudden turns, and shifting ground, with no second leg standing ready to catch the sideways force if it ever slips past what the joint alone can manage. None of this yet explains why that joint tends to wear down the way it often does over the course of a long human life, or what exactly happens inside cartilage and ligament tissue as years of that solo, twisting workload accumulates step after step, season after season. What it does establish, clearly, is the mechanical starting point beneath the entire question. The structural inheritance passed down from that early shift away from 4-limbed movement, a shift that solved one problem, freeing the hands and lifting the head higher above tall grasses to see farther across open land, while quietly creating another problem lodged permanently inside a single joint in each leg. The body that resulted from that trade was never simply better or worse than the 4-legged body it moved away from. It was different, shaped by a different set of pressures, carrying a different kind of risk built into its architecture from the very beginning of that upright walk. Somewhere in that same long transition, as hands lifted free from the ground and the skull balanced higher above the shoulders, the legs alone became responsible for a task that used to be shared across 4 limbs working together, and the knee inherited the largest share of that new responsibility, absorbing forces that once passed through a broader, more distributed frame. A 4-legged body spreads a sudden jolt, a stumble on uneven ground, or the impact of a fast stride across several joints and several limbs at once, diluting the force before it can concentrate anywhere in particular. A 2-legged body has far fewer places for that same force to go, but much of it arrives, again and again, at this one point below the thigh and above the shin. Nothing about this arrangement suggests a mistake or a flaw introduced along the way. It reads instead as one solution among several possible ones, chosen not because it was the safest option for every joint in the body, but because it opened up other advantages that mattered more at the time: a freed pair of hands, a taller line of sight, a different way of covering long distances across open terrain. What it left behind, quietly, was a single joint asked to do the work of several, absorbing weight, correcting alignment, and enduring rotation all at once, every single time either foot touches the ground. And the story of exactly how that inherited arrangement plays out over the course of a lifetime, of what it actually felt like for a body once accustomed to trees and 4 points of contact to trust its full weight to open ground for the first time, is only beginning to take shape. Somewhere behind every one of these mechanical facts sits a much quieter question that pure anatomy alone cannot answer. A question about the ground itself, about what kind of surface a newly upright body was actually stepping onto during those first generations away from the trees, whether it was soft or hard, level or broken, forgiving or not, and how much of what the knee eventually had to absorb was shaped as much by that unfamiliar terrain underfoot as by the joint's own internal design. Now picture the last stretch of movement through a canopy before the ground finally takes over. Light breaking unevenly through overlapping leaves, bark rough and slightly damp beneath a gripping hand, a branch flexing just slightly under sudden weight before settling. A hand releases one branch just as the other reaches for the next, weight passing constantly between 4 separate grips, so that even a slight miscalculation, a snapped twig or a shifting limb underfoot, rarely means a true fall, because some other hand or foot is almost always still holding on somewhere above. There is a kind of built-in forgiveness to moving this way, a body suspended among many small points of contact rather than balanced on just one or two, each grip ready to take over the instant another one gives way without warning. Now picture the moment that pattern ends, when the last branch is let go and 2 feet alone meet whatever lies below, no longer soft moving wood, but fixed ground, uneven and unfamiliar, in a way no single tree limb ever was. This is the shift sitting quietly underneath the mechanical picture already laid out, the actual physical setting in which a body built to solve its own balance internally first had to prove that design against real terrain rather than smooth open pavement. Moving through trees offers something the ground never quite does, a constant web of extra points of contact available at almost any moment, so that the work of staying upright is spread not only across the legs but across the arms and hands as well, each one able to grip, adjust, or catch a slip before it turns into anything serious. In that setting, a poorly placed foot rarely mattered on its own, because a hand nearby could compensate instantly, taking sudden strain off a joint before real force had time to build. As movement shifted toward the ground, and travel came to depend mainly on the legs rather than a mix of arms and legs together, that constant backup system quietly stopped being part of the routine experience of getting from one place to another. The hands did not vanish, and they remained just as capable of reaching out during an actual stumble, but during the ordinary rhythm of walking itself, step after step across open terrain, they were no longer positioned overhead ready to catch anything the way they once were among branches. This removed something that mattered more than it might first appear. It has already been established that the knee carries the full mechanical burden of a single misaligned step alone, with no second leg standing by to share the load in that instant. Life spent moving through trees had quietly softened that burden in a different way, not by changing what the knee itself had to do, but by keeping a second line of defense close at hand whenever the first line, the joint itself, was pushed too far by an unexpected shift in footing. Once daily movement settled onto open ground, that second line of defense was no longer part of the routine of walking, leaving the knee's own internal stabilizers, the same fibrous bands already carrying the ordinary weight of every stride, to also absorb whatever additional strain arrived from ground that refused to behave predictably. None of this happened as a single clean switch from one way of moving to another. Comparative study of early hominin skeletons shows a body still carrying clear signs of tree use well after regular ground walking had already begun. Curved finger and toe bones suited to gripping branches, shoulder and arm proportions built for climbing, appearing in the same individuals whose hip and knee bones already show adaptations for walking upright on 2 legs. Read together, these features suggest a long stretch of overlap rather than a sudden departure, generations in which a body may have climbed for part of each day, and walked upright across open or broken ground for another part of it, moving back and forth between 2 very different sets of demands on the same joints. That overlap matters for the knee specifically, because it means the loss of the arm as a reliable backup during a misstep was not an event but a gradual erosion. a support system available less and less often across many generations rather than removed all at once, so that the internal stabilizers already carrying so much of the load had increasingly less outside help to rely on with each passing stretch of this long transition. Long before ground walking became the only way a body knew how to move at all, what made this especially demanding was the ground itself, because the environment early bipedal ancestors were moving through was rarely a single tidy surface. Evidence drawn from ancient soils, plant remains, and the animal bones recovered alongside early hominin fossils points toward a shifting mosaic of habitat during this period. Patches of denser woodland bordering more open, broken ground, rather than one uniform setting, and reconstructing exactly how much of each type of terrain any particular population actually moved across remains an active and still developing area of research. What that patchwork meant underfoot was real variation from one stride to the next, soft, cushioned leaf litter and decomposing plant matter in one stretch, giving way to harder packed clearings, loose stones, exposed roots, and uneven slopes in another, especially near the edges where denser woodland thinned into more open country. A joint asked to manage its own rotation and its own sideways stability, without a spare limb overhead to catch a mistake, was now doing that work across ground, offering no consistent promise about what the next footfall would actually feel like. This unpredictability was not only a matter of moving from one patch of habitat to another either. Evidence drawn from ancient climate and plant records suggests that the same stretch of land could look quite different across a single year, wetter and softer underfoot during certain seasons, harder and more exposed during others, with the balance between wooded and open ground shifting gradually over longer stretches of time as regional climate patterns changed. A body relying on its knee as the last line of defense against uneven footing was therefore not adapting to one fixed kind of terrain and then finished with the problem. It was moving through a setting that kept redefining what counted as solid, predictable ground, season after season and generation after generation, so that the internal stabilizing work already asked of a single joint had to remain reliable across a genuinely wide range of conditions rather than one familiar, unchanging surface. This variation was not only spread across seasons and generations, but could also show up within a single stretch of movement, particularly near the edges where woodland thinned into more open country, a boundary zone many early hominins likely crossed repeatedly rather than settling permanently on one side of it. A body foraging near this kind of edge might walk across open, broken ground for a stretch, climb briefly for food, safety, or a better vantage point, then return to walking again shortly after, moving back and forth between the two support systems multiple times within a single day, rather than making one clean transition and never looking back. Each return to the ground after even a short spell among branches meant the knee resumed its full, unshared workload again almost immediately, with no gradual reintroduction, simply the same demanding job picking back up the moment weight settled onto 2 feet once more. Among the most striking direct evidence for this period comes not from bones at all but from footprints themselves, preserved in rare instances where volcanic ash settled soft enough to record a footfall and then hardened before it could wash away, leaving a physical trace of an upright, two-legged stride pressed into ground that existed millions of years ago. Sites like this offer something bone alone cannot, an actual walking pattern captured directly, striking many researchers as recognizably similar in basic form to a modern human gait, evidence that upright walking over exactly this kind of uneven, unpredictable surface was already an established part of daily movement very early in this story, not a late refinement added long afterward. Looked at closely, a preserved trackway like this can show a deeper heel strike than a lighter-footed animal would leave, a rounded impression at the base of the big toe suggesting weight rolling forward and off through that single point at the end of each step, and a spacing between prints that implies a steady, controlled stride rather than an unstable or hesitant one. None of this depth of detail could survive in bone alone. A skeleton can suggest how a joint was shaped and how it likely moved, but a hardened footprint captures something closer to the actual event itself. Weight arriving, shifting, and departing through a single foot on a single afternoon many generations ago, fixed in place by chance rather than reconstructed afterward from indirect evidence. Even here, caution matters, since a small number of preserved trackways can only reveal so much about the full range of terrain a population encountered across its lifetime, and researchers remain careful about how far to generalize from any single preserved surface. Still, what these traces confirm is enough to sharpen the question rather than resolve it, because a footprint records the outcome of a single step, the shape a foot left behind, but says nothing on its own about what that same repeated pressure, stride after stride across years of walking on ground like this, was actually doing to the joint just above it, hidden entirely from view, inside bone and cartilage that no footprint could ever show directly. That deeper question, the one written not into ash but into the bones and joint surfaces of the walkers themselves, is where the story has to turn next, toward whatever physical trace, if any, this kind of demanding, unpredictable terrain may have left behind on the knee across a lifetime of movement, and toward what the physical remains of those early bodies can still reveal about a burden that ash and footprints alone were never able to fully capture. A footprint can show that a stride looks steady on the surface, but it cannot show what that same repeated pressure was quietly doing beneath the skin, inside cartilage, bone, and the fibrous tissue holding a joint together stride after stride across an entire lifetime spent walking ground this unpredictable. Only the remains of the joints themselves, examined directly rather than inferred from an impression left in ash, could begin to answer whether this demanding, ever-shifting terrain left any lasting mark on the bodies that walked across it, and what shape that mark might have taken. Picture a single fragment of bone resting under bright, even light on a table lined with soft cloth, a curved section no longer than a hand, pale and slightly porous where time has worn away its outer surface, turned slowly between careful fingers so every angle can be measured, before it is set back down exactly where it was found. Before it ever reached that table, a fragment like this typically spent an enormous stretch of time buried beneath layers of sediment, compressed and slowly mineralized until the bone itself had partly turned to stone, exposed again only by chance through shifting soil, weathering, or the deliberate, painstaking work of researchers clearing away sediment one thin layer at a time in a location already suspected to hold remains from deep in this story. This is not a whole leg and rarely ever is. It is a piece of one, a lower end of a thigh bone perhaps, or the upper portion of a shin, recovered from sediment that has held it in place for an immense stretch of time, and the entire question of what this fragment can and cannot reveal about a life lived long ago comes down to reading its shape with total precision, since there is no other way left to ask the body itself what it once carried. Among the very first things a researcher looks for in a fragment like this is a particular angle at the lower end of the thigh bone, the point where it would have met the knee, because in a body that walks upright on two legs, this bone does not run straight down from hip to knee the way it might first seem to. It leans slightly inward as it descends, drawing the knees closer together beneath a narrow base so that the feet can land nearly under the body's center of gravity with each stride, an arrangement already explained mechanically earlier in this story. That inward lean leaves a measurable physical signature on the bone itself, a distinct angle at the lower end where the thigh bone meets the knee that differs clearly from the straighter, more vertical thigh bones typical of animals whose weight is shared across four limbs rather than balanced on two. Researchers rely on exactly this angle as one of the clearest physical markers separating a body built for upright. Two-legged walking from one built for a different kind of movement entirely, and its presence in fossil fragments recovered from ancient sediment offers some of the strongest direct evidence available that this particular way of moving reaches back deep into this story, long before any written record, long before any preserved footprint, carried in bone that survived when soft tissue and skin did not. What makes this particular angle so valuable to researchers is not just that it appears, but where and how consistently it appears across an entire span of fossil specimens separated from one another by enormous stretches of time, recovered from different locations, different rock layers, and different points along this long story. Rather than relying on a single fragment to make any claim, researchers look for this same angled pattern to repeat itself across many separate individuals spanning a considerable depth of time, treating consistency across specimens as far stronger evidence than any one bone could ever provide alone. Establishing what counts as a meaningfully angled thigh bone in the first place depends heavily on comparison, measuring fossil specimens not only against modern human bone, where this angle is already well documented, but also against the thigh bones of living apes that move primarily on four limbs or through trees, whose equivalent bone descends in a straighter line without that same inward lean. Researchers rarely rely on this angle in isolation either, since a single measurement from one damaged fragment carries more weight when it lines up with other signs recovered from the same individual or the same location, features in the hip, the foot, or the lower spine that independently point toward the same conclusion about how that body once moved, so that the picture built from any one site tends to rest on several converging lines of skeletal evidence, rather than this angle standing entirely on its own. Placed side by side, these three references, ancient fossil, modern human, and living ape, give researchers a working scale against which to judge where any newly recovered fragment actually falls, rather than relying on impression or intuition about what counts as angled enough to matter. This comparative approach carries its own honest limitation as well, since living apes today are not frozen replicas of whatever ancestor humans once shared with them, but species that have continued changing along their own path across the very same enormous stretch of time, meaning any comparison offers a useful reference point, rather than a perfect stand-in for what that shared ancestor's own body actually looked like. Alongside this angle, researchers also study the surface of the joint itself, where the thigh bone would have met the shin, examining how that surface curves, how deeply grooved certain areas appear, and how symmetrical or uneven the wear looks across different parts of the joint, since even after so much time has passed, bone can still record something about the mechanical history it experienced while its owner was alive. A joint used consistently for upright walking tends to show particular patterns in how its surfaces are shaped, and how bone density varies across them, patterns that differ in identifiable ways from joints belonging to animals moving primarily on four limbs. In some recovered fragments, researchers also note areas where the bone surface appears remodeled or slightly altered compared to a perfectly smooth, healthy reference, changes that can sometimes reflect mechanical stress accumulated over a lifetime of movement, though this particular kind of evidence has to be handled with real caution rather than treated as a simple direct readout of pain or injury. Bone remodeling can result from many different causes layered on top of one another: ordinary mechanical loading during life, occasional injury, diet, general health, and processes that occur naturally to bone after death as it sits buried for an immense span of time, and separating these different causes from a single fragment recovered without any surrounding context is rarely straightforward. Researchers examining this kind of evidence generally avoid drawing firm conclusions from any one fragment alone, instead comparing patterns across multiple specimens where possible, and remaining explicit about how much uncertainty still surrounds any single interpretation. One particular sign researchers sometimes note on an aging joint surface is an area that has become unusually smooth or slightly polished compared to the surrounding bone, a change that in some contexts is associated with prolonged, repeated contact between two bone surfaces after the cushioning cartilage between them has thinned or broken down. Even this kind of sign has to be interpreted carefully rather than read as automatic proof of a specific condition, since a polished patch can result from more than one underlying process, and distinguishing between them from bone alone, without the soft tissue that originally surrounded it, is often genuinely difficult. Beyond the difficulty of interpreting any single sign correctly, there is a more basic limitation sitting underneath all of this evidence, which is simply how few specimens exist to study in the first place. Well-preserved fragments, specifically capturing the knee region from the earliest part of this story, remain genuinely rare, recovered only a handful of times across an enormous span of searching, meaning researchers are often working from a small number of specimens when trying to describe patterns for an entire ancient population. Because the sample is so limited, honest disagreement among researchers about how to interpret particular fragments is common and expected, part of ordinary scientific practice rather than a sign that the underlying method is unreliable, and conclusions in this area tend to shift somewhat, as new specimens are recovered and existing ones are re-examined with improved methods. There are deeper limits built into this entire type of evidence that are worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over. The fossil record itself is fragmentary by nature, shaped as much by which environments happen to preserve bone well and which individuals happen to be recovered by researchers centuries later, as by anything about the population as a whole, meaning any single fragment represents one body among countless others whose remains were never preserved or never found at all. Bone can also only ever tell part of the story on its own terms, because it registers the angle of a joint and certain signs of mechanical stress on its outer surface, but it cannot show what was happening at the same time inside the cartilage that once cushioned that same joint, tissue that breaks down and disappears entirely long before any bone fragment is ever recovered from the ground. A thigh bone can confirm, with real confidence, that its owner walked upright on two legs, carrying weight through a knee angled the way this story has already described. It cannot say, on its own, exactly how that same knee's soft internal tissue, the cartilage, the ligaments, the fibrous stabilizing bands already discussed, actually held up across a lifetime of walking on ground this demanding, because none of that soft material survives long enough to be examined directly millions of years later. What remains, then, is a genuine gap between what hardened bone can confirm with real certainty and what actually happened, moment to moment, inside a joint's living tissue while its owner was still walking across uneven, unpredictable ground. Bone can prove the angle existed. Bone can prove upright walking was already well established very early in this story. Bone can even hint, cautiously, at signs of accumulated stress on certain recovered surfaces. What bone alone cannot do is explain why cartilage, once it wears down under this kind of mechanical demand, behaves so differently from skin or bone when it comes to healing afterward. Why a tissue asked to absorb this much repeated stress across an entire lifetime turns out to be so poorly equipped, compared to so much of the rest of the body, to repair itself once that stress eventually takes its toll. Every fragment examined so far has pointed outward, toward angle, toward terrain, toward the mechanical arrangement of a joint built to work largely alone. None of it has yet looked inward, at the living material actually doing that work, at what cartilage is made of, how it survives, and why, once damaged, it so rarely returns to what it once was. That question belongs to living tissue, not to fossilized bone, and it is the question this story now has to turn toward directly. Notice how quickly a small scrape on the back of a hand changes over the course of a single week, the raw edge closing, a thin scab forming and then falling away, new skin visible underneath within days, redness fading, the whole process moving forward steadily enough to watch it happen in something close to real time, almost as if the body were narrating its own repair out loud, through colour and texture changing daily on the surface of the skin. That visible speed depends on something happening just beneath the surface that is easy to take for granted, a dense supply of small blood vessels running directly through the skin itself, delivering repair cells, clotting factors, and fresh nutrients straight to the site of the injury almost as soon as damage occurs. Now picture, instead, a joint working quietly beneath skin and muscle. With every single step taken across a long lifetime of ordinary walking, the same knee already described as carrying the full mechanical burden of upright walking largely alone, and ask what kind of repair system waits inside it when something there gets worn down rather than simply cut. The honest answer is nothing close to what waits patiently beneath a scraped, healing hand. Most of the smooth, glassy tissue lining the ends of the bones inside the knee has no blood vessels running through it at all, a condition researchers call avascular, meaning the rapid delivery system responsible for healing skin so visibly within days simply does not exist inside this particular tissue in anything like the same form. Instead of blood vessels threading directly through it, this tissue receives what nourishment it gets, mainly through a thin layer of fluid that surrounds the joint, nutrients moving slowly by diffusion from that fluid into the tissue rather than arriving quickly through a dedicated network of vessels built for rapid transport. Diffusion of this particular kind is a fundamentally slower process than blood flow, closer to nutrients gradually soaking through a dense material than being pumped directly to where they are needed, and it means that any repair happening inside this tissue proceeds at a pace set by slow chemical movement rather than by the fast responsive delivery system available almost everywhere else in the body. The fluid responsible for carrying whatever nourishment does reach this tissue is not simple liquid sitting idle inside the joint either. It is thick and slightly viscous, produced by a thin membrane lining the inner surface of the joint capsule, and it serves two purposes at once inside the same small space: reducing friction between moving surfaces so bone does not grind directly against bone with every bend of the knee, while also acting as the sole pathway through which nutrients travel toward the tissue described here, meaning this fluid has to accomplish both mechanical lubrication and biological nourishment simultaneously, using the same limited volume of liquid sealed within the joint capsule. Movement itself plays a role in how well this fluid actually reaches the tissue that depends on it, since the gentle compression and release created by ordinary bending and straightening helps work fluid into and out of this tissue somewhat, the way repeatedly squeezing a saturated sponge helps move liquid through it, a slow rhythmic exchange happening quietly with every step, meaning the same repetitive mechanical loading responsible for gradually wearing this tissue down over time is also, in a more limited way, part of what keeps it nourished enough to survive at all, under conditions no other major tissue in the body is asked to tolerate in quite the same combination. There is a second reason repair moves this slowly, sitting alongside the lack of blood supply rather than replacing it as an explanation. The cells living within this tissue, responsible for maintaining and rebuilding it over time, exist in much lower numbers relative to the surrounding material than cells typically do in skin or bone, scattered thinly through a dense structural matrix rather than packed closely together, ready to multiply quickly in response to damage. Skin cells divide rapidly and repeatedly when injury calls for it, replacing lost tissue in a matter of days, visible proof of a repair system built for speed. The cells inside this joint tissue divide far less readily, sparse and slow-moving by comparison, meaning even once nutrients do arrive through slow diffusion, there are comparatively few active cells positioned to use them for rebuilding damaged structure. Put these two limitations together, poor nutrient delivery and a sparse, slow-dividing cell population, and the result is a tissue built to endure enormous repeated mechanical load throughout a lifetime, while possessing remarkably little internal capacity to rebuild itself once that load causes real damage, a genuine mismatch between how much this tissue is asked to withstand every single day and how well equipped it actually is to recover afterward. This mismatch connects directly back to everything already established about this joint's peculiar situation, since a structure already carrying the entire mechanical burden of upright walking without a second leg to share it, without an arm nearby to catch a misstep, is precisely the kind of structure where slow, limited healing matters most, because there is no lighter-duty version of walking available to rest this tissue, while it slowly attempts to repair itself, no way to simply set the joint aside the way a hand might be kept still while a cut on it closes. This same comparison helps explain something already touched on earlier in this story, the fact that bone itself, unlike this particular joint tissue, does carry its own internal blood supply, running through small channels threaded directly into its structure, which is precisely why researchers examining ancient fossilized bone can still find signs of remodeling and repair carried out while its owner was alive, evidence of a tissue that, however slowly by everyday standards, was nonetheless capable of responding to mechanical stress and rebuilding itself to some degree over time. The tissue at the very center of this joint, cushioning bone against bone with every stride, shares none of that advantage. It sits immediately beside a material fully capable of gradual self-repair, while itself possessing almost none of the same equipment, two neighboring tissues within the same joint, subjected to much the same repeated mechanical demand, yet built with drastically different capacities to recover from it, a quiet asymmetry hidden entirely beneath the skin, and easy to overlook until it becomes the exact reason healing does not happen the way it might elsewhere in the body. Sitting at the very center of this slow healing tissue, taking on a substantial share of the mechanical load with every stride, is a pair of crescent-shaped wedges of tissue fitted between the thigh bone and shin bone, curved structures shaped somewhat like thickened, tapered slices positioned on either side of the joint, whose job is to spread out the force of each footfall across a broader area of the joint surface, rather than allowing it to concentrate entirely on one small point. Without structures like this doing that work, the full weight arriving through the leg with each stride would land far more directly onto the ends of the two bones themselves, concentrating stress into a smaller contact area than the joint was ever built to handle safely on a repeated basis. These wedge-shaped structures act as a kind of built-in buffer, absorbing and distributing the shock of movement across a wider surface, allowing the joint to tolerate the same repeated demand already described, weight arriving through a single leg with every stride, twisting slightly to correct alignment, resisting sideways force largely on its own, without concentrating all of that punishment onto one narrow point of contact. Even within this buffering tissue itself, blood supply is not distributed evenly, another detail easy to overlook. Only the outer rim of each wedge-shaped structure, the edge nearest the surrounding capsule of the joint, receives any meaningful blood supply at all, while the larger inner portion, extending toward the center of the joint, remains almost entirely without direct blood vessels, relying on the same slow diffusion process described earlier for whatever nourishment it manages to receive. This uneven distribution has real consequences. Damage occurring near the outer, better supplied edge of this tissue has some genuine access to the body's ordinary repair resources and can, in some cases, heal to a meaningful degree over time. Damage occurring deeper toward the center, in the largely blood-free inner portion, has far less access to those same resources, meaning tissue in that region tends to heal far more slowly, incompletely, or in some cases not at all, depending on the extent and location of the damage, a distinction that matters far beyond simple curiosity, since it means the exact location of where within this small structure can determine how much recovery is realistically possible afterward. None of this describes a flaw introduced by mistake, any more than the mechanical arrangement already discussed earlier in this story represents one. It describes a tissue built primarily for structural endurance rather than rapid repair, well suited to distributing enormous repeated load across a joint working largely alone, but never particularly well equipped to rebuild itself quickly once that same load eventually causes genuine damage. A trade-off embedded quietly into the very design of the tissue itself. What remains unexplored so far is what this slow healing tissue is actually being asked to withstand across an entire lifetime. Not in any single dramatic moment, but in the sheer accumulated arithmetic of ordinary walking, repeated day after day, year after year, decade after decade, a quiet mathematics of distance and repetition that this story has not yet begun to add up. Everything laid out so far has focused on mechanism, on what this tissue is made of, how poorly it is supplied, and how little internal capacity it carries to rebuild itself once damaged. None of it has yet asked the more basic question sitting underneath all of it, which is simply how much total demand a body actually places on this particular joint over the full span of an ordinary human life. How many individual footfalls, how many miles covered on foot, how many years spent asking this same slow healing tissue to keep absorbing weight it was never given strong tools to recover from. A tissue this fragile, sitting inside a joint already carrying its mechanical burden largely alone, only makes full sense once that lifetime scale of demand is placed directly beside it. Weight, twist, sideways force, and repetition multiplied out across years rather than considered one single ordinary step at a time. And that reckoning belongs to what comes next in this story. Picture an ordinary day continuing past its usual length, walking, not stopping, when the light begins to fade, but carrying on into evening, into the next morning, into another full day after that, each stride landing much like the one before it, distance folding into distance until the total no longer resembles anything a single afternoon could contain, and no single moment along the way feels remarkable enough on its own to notice. This is the scale sitting underneath the question left open at the end of the previous stretch of this story. Not what a single step does to a joint, but what several thousand individual steps taken in one ordinary day, repeated across many years, actually add up to when nothing is left out of the count. A body walking at even a modest, unremarkable pace across the course of one full day covers several thousand separate footfalls without any particular effort or intention behind that number, simply the natural byproduct of moving from place to place the way any land-based body eventually must. Multiply that ordinary daily total across the years contained in a typical human lifetime, and the resulting figure moves into the tens of millions of individual footfalls, each one funneling weight through the same joint already described as carrying that burden largely alone, each one asking the same slow-healing tissue already described to absorb its share before the next one arrives close behind it. No other tissue in the body faces quite this particular combination, an enormous cumulative count of repeated impacts spread across an entire lifetime, landing on a joint with limited internal capacity to recover fully between them, each footfall arriving almost before the consequences of the last one have had any real chance to settle. What makes this accumulated scale especially significant for the human body specifically becomes clearer through comparison with other apes moving through their own environments. Chimpanzees and gorillas, close relatives sharing much of the same basic skeletal plan, generally cover far shorter distances in the course of an ordinary day, their movement shaped by living within denser forest habitat, where food sources tend to sit closer together and there is less need to travel far in search of the next meal or water source. Early hominin ancestors, moving through the shifting mosaic of woodland and more open ground, already described earlier in this story, faced a different ecological reality, one where useful food and water sources were often spread more widely across the landscape, favouring bodies capable of covering considerably greater distances on a regular basis, simply to meet ordinary daily needs. This is not a claim that any specific ancient individual walked a precisely known distance on any particular day, since no evidence could ever support that level of detail about a single, unrecorded life lived so long ago, but a broader, more defensible observation drawn from comparing the ecology of forest-dwelling apes against the more open, dispersed habitats early bipedal ancestors are understood to have moved through, an observation reinforced by studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations whose typical daily foraging distances tend to run considerably longer than the day ranges recorded for forest-dwelling great apes, offering a cautious, comparative reference point, rather than a precise measurement reaching back across deep time. This pattern of covering greater daily distance was not a temporary phase confined to one especially demanding stretch of this story either. Comparative anatomical evidence, including the angled thigh bone and other bipedal features already discussed, appears consistently across a wide span of hominin fossils separated by enormous stretches of time, suggesting that a body suited to this kind of sustained, efficient, long-distance movement remained broadly in place across many successive generations, rather than emerging briefly and then disappearing again. Each of those generations, across whatever length of time researchers estimate this pattern actually persisted, would have placed a broadly similar cumulative demand on the knees of the individuals living through it, meaning the vulnerability being described here was not a passing circumstance affecting one unlucky stretch of this evolutionary story, but a recurring condition repeated across a genuinely long span of time, generation layered upon generation, each one walking, each one accumulating its own tens of millions of footfalls across its own lifetime. Covering this much greater daily distance, and continuing to do so across an entire evolutionary lineage rather than as an occasional exception, placed unusual demands on a body already built around the mechanical arrangement described earlier, a single leg alone at a time, a knee managing both bend and rotation without a second limb sharing the load. Meeting that demand efficiently, decade after decade, required more than simply asking muscles to work harder with every single stride, since muscle-powered movement alone carries a real energy cost that would make covering such distances regularly exhausting in a way unlikely to be sustainable day after day. Instead, the human leg developed structures capable of storing and returning energy passively with each stride, most notably a long, springy tendon running down the back of the lower leg that stretches slightly as weight lands and then recoils, releasing some of that stored energy back into the next step, much the way a stretched elastic band snaps back after being released, reducing how much active muscular effort each individual stride actually requires. Alongside these elastic tendons and arches, the human body also developed unusually large muscles across the buttocks and hip, considerably larger relative to body size than the equivalent muscles found in other apes, whose primary job during walking and running is not driving the leg forward but stabilizing the trunk directly above the hip during exactly the single leg stance phase already described earlier in this story, the moment when one leg alone bears the entire weight of the body while the other swings freely through the air. Without adequate stabilization at the hip during that vulnerable instant, the trunk would tend to tilt or rotate excessively toward the unsupported side with every stride, a wobble that would in turn transmit additional twisting stress downward into the knee below, compounding the rotational demand that joint already has to manage on its own. Larger, more capable hip and buttock muscles help keep the trunk steady overhead during that critical instant, meaning at least part of the sideways instability problem already described is addressed one joint higher up in the body, rather than left entirely to the knee and its internal stabilizing tissue to resolve alone. Even with this additional muscular support in place, the fundamental arithmetic already established does not change in any meaningful way. Better trunk stabilization at the hip may reduce some of the additional twisting stress reaching the knee during each stride, but it does nothing to reduce the sheer vertical weight still passing directly through that same joint, with every one of the tens of millions of footfalls accumulated across a lifetime of covering this much distance. The arch running along the underside of the foot works in a broadly similar way, flattening slightly under load and springing back as weight shifts forward, another passive mechanism helping return a portion of each stride's energy, rather than requiring it to be regenerated entirely from muscle every single time a foot touches the ground. These elastic structures made covering greater daily distances metabolically more sustainable, allowing a body to travel farther without proportionally exhausting itself in the process. A genuine efficiency gained through the addition of spring-like tissue elsewhere in the leg. What these elastic structures do not do, however, is reduce the raw mechanical force still passing directly through the knee with every one of those strides. Storing and returning energy in a tendon or an arch changes how much muscular work is required to keep moving forward, but it does nothing to lighten the actual weight of the body still traveling downward through the knee joint at the moment. Each foot strikes the ground, still requiring the same combined hinge and rotation movement already described, still relying on the same limited, slow-healing tissue already described to absorb that repeated impact. In other words, becoming more efficient at covering long distances did not spare the knee from bearing weight. It simply made covering far more distance, and therefore accumulating far more total footfalls across a lifetime, genuinely possible in the first place. This creates a particular kind of paradox sitting quietly at the very center of this part of the story, one easy to miss precisely because every individual piece of it looks, on its own, like nothing but progress. The very efficiency that allowed early bipedal ancestors to travel farther than other apes ever needed to, following resources scattered across a more open landscape, is the same efficiency that ultimately delivered a far larger cumulative total of repeated mechanical stress to a joint already working largely alone, already possessing limited internal capacity to recover between one impact and the next. A body that had remained less efficient, covering shorter distances the way many other apes still do, would have placed a smaller cumulative burden on this same joint across an entire lifetime. Becoming better at covering distance did not solve the knee's underlying vulnerability. It multiplied the number of times that vulnerability was tested, stride after stride, across a lifetime spent moving farther than almost any other ape's body was ever required to move. And this raises a genuinely open question that pure mechanics alone cannot answer, one this story has not yet been able to resolve, about why a body capable of solving so many other demanding problems along the way toward this kind of sustained, efficient movement across long distances, a spring-like tendon here, a stabilizing muscle there, an arch capable of returning its own stored energy, never developed a comparable solution for the one joint bearing the fullest brunt of that same accomplishment. Every other piece of this system received some form of structural reinforcement suited to the demand placed upon it. The knee, carrying more repeated cumulative impact across a lifetime than perhaps any other joint in the body, received a comparatively modest set of tools by comparison: a hinge, a small allowance for rotation, a pair of wedge-shaped cushions with limited blood supply, fibrous bands doing quiet, unglamorous stabilizing work. Whether that comparative gap reflects some deeper constraint on what evolution could plausibly build within this particular joint, some trade-off involving flexibility, size, or the demands of childbirth already shaping the pelvis in other ways, or simply a limit on how much protection any biological structure could ever realistically provide against this much repeated, unavoidable mechanical stress accumulated over so many millions of steps, remains a genuinely unresolved question, one worth sitting with carefully rather than answering too quickly. Sit for a moment, quietly, with the shape of the question left open at the end of the last stretch of this story rather than rushing past it toward an easy answer, the way a person might sit with a puzzle whose pieces all seem to fit somewhere yet never quite complete the picture, because there genuinely is no single, settled answer waiting here the way there was for the angle of a fossilized bone or the mechanics of a single stride. This is the point in the story where the ground shifts from what has already been established with real confidence toward what remains an active, ongoing argument among researchers who study this exact puzzle, a body that solved so many demanding problems on its way toward efficient, sustained movement across long distances, yet left its most heavily used joint with what looks, on close inspection, like a comparatively modest set of tools for enduring that same demand across an entire lifetime. Several candidate explanations exist for this apparent gap, none of them proven beyond reasonable doubt, each one illuminating a different piece of a puzzle that may ultimately require more than one answer at once rather than a single tidy resolution. It helps, before working through these explanations individually, to understand why a question phrased this way tends to resist a clean answer in the first place. Confirming that a particular feature exists, that a bone carries a certain angle, or that a joint moves in a certain way, rests on direct physical evidence that can be measured and compared. Explaining why some alternative feature never evolved instead asks about a path history never actually took, a road not travelled that left behind no fossil, no footprint, and no physical trace of its own to examine directly, meaning any explanation for its absence has to be built through careful reasoning about trade-offs and pressures, rather than read straight off a specimen the way a bone's angle can be. One of the most widely discussed explanations begins not with the knee itself, but with a much broader question about how natural selection actually operates across the full arc of a lifetime. Selection acts most powerfully on traits that influence whether an individual survives long enough to reproduce and successfully raise offspring to the point where those offspring can do the same. A vulnerability that tends to accumulate slowly and only becomes seriously limiting later in life, well past the years most central to reproduction and early child rearing, faces a much weaker selective pressure pushing against it than a vulnerability that threatens survival or reproduction earlier on. If the worst consequences of this particular joint's limited healing capacity tended, across evolutionary history, to become most apparent later in adulthood rather than during the years most critical for raising the next generation, that timing alone could help explain why stronger reinforcement never evolved, not because such reinforcement was impossible to build, but because the cost of not having it simply mattered less to reproductive success than other competing demands on the same body. This explanation carries a real limitation worth stating plainly. Establishing exactly when, across deep evolutionary history, this kind of joint wear typically became severe enough to matter is genuinely difficult, since the same fragmentary fossil evidence, already discussed earlier in this story, rarely preserves enough detail to reconstruct how old a particular individual actually was when joint-related decline began interfering meaningfully with movement, leaving this timing argument plausible but not something that can be confirmed with real precision from the evidence currently available. There is a further complication worth acknowledging honestly as well. Since selection in ancestral populations may not have depended solely on an individual's own direct reproduction, but also on that individual's continued contribution to the survival of already born children and grandchildren, a consideration some researchers raise when discussing why certain costs appearing later in life are not automatically invisible to natural selection, the way a strictly reproduction-only framing might suggest, adding real nuance to a hypothesis that can otherwise sound simpler than the evidence actually allows. A second, quite different explanation focuses not on when costs occur, but on a different kind of trade-off, this one rooted in basic mechanics rather than reproductive timing. Every animal that moves its limbs through the air with each stride pays an energy cost proportional to how much mass sits in that limb, particularly toward its lower, swinging end, since a heavier lower leg requires more muscular effort to accelerate forward and then decelerate again with every single step. Across many different species, this basic mechanical relationship favors legs that stay relatively light and slender toward the foot and ankle, while concentrating heavier muscle mass closer to the hip, where it contributes less to the ongoing cost of swinging the limb back and forth. Building a knee with substantially thicker cartilage, denser surrounding tissue, or a more heavily reinforced structure overall would very likely have added meaningful weight to exactly the part of the leg where added weight carries the steepest ongoing energy cost, a cost paid with literally every stride across an entire lifetime of the sustained, efficient long-distance movement already described earlier in this story. Under this view, the knee's comparatively modest construction is not simply an oversight, but potentially the outcome of a genuine trade-off, a joint kept lighter than maximum durability alone would suggest, in exchange for keeping the overall metabolic cost of covering long distances low enough to remain sustainable across a lifetime. A similar pattern shows up across many other animals built for efficient, sustained travel over land, where the lower portion of the leg tends to be noticeably slender and tendon-rich, with the bulk of muscle mass concentrated much higher up, closer to the hip or shoulder, rather than distributed evenly along the entire limb. Deer and horses, both capable of covering considerable distances efficiently, show this same general pattern in their own lower legs, thin, largely tendon-based structures below the knee-equivalent joint, carrying comparatively little muscle mass of their own. The recurrence of this same basic arrangement across such different lineages, all facing broadly similar mechanical pressures around the cost of swinging a limb repeatedly through the air, lends some real support to the idea that keeping the lower leg light, even at some cost to how heavily reinforced a joint like the knee could otherwise have been, reflects a genuine, recurring evolutionary trade-off rather than a coincidence unique to this one particular story. This explanation, too, comes with an honest limitation. Precisely how much reinforcement would actually have been required to meaningfully reduce this vulnerability, and precisely how much that reinforcement would have cost in added weight and energy expenditure, are difficult figures to pin down with real certainty, since no direct experimental version of this alternative design ever existed to compare against the body that actually evolved. A third explanation looks upward from the knee toward the hip and pelvis, a region already shown earlier in this story to carry its own significant competing demands. The same pelvis responsible for anchoring the powerful, stabilizing muscles already described, keeping the trunk steady during single leg support, is also directly involved in the size and shape of the birth canal, through which offspring must eventually pass, a genuinely difficult evolutionary balancing act already recognized among researchers studying human reproduction and locomotion together. Any change to hip or thigh bone geometry aimed specifically at reducing stress on the knee below would very likely have carried consequences for this same structure above it, meaning proposed adjustments to protect one joint may have run directly into constraints imposed by an entirely different, and arguably even more urgent, biological requirement. This particular tension has been discussed by researchers studying human reproduction and locomotion together for some time, sometimes framed as a genuine balancing act between a pelvis narrow and efficient enough for economical upright walking, and a pelvis wide enough to allow a large brained offspring to be born successfully, two competing pressures acting on the very same bones responsible, further down the leg, for setting the angle already discussed at length earlier in this story. A pelvis reshaped primarily to reduce downstream stress on the knee, without regard for this other, more immediate requirement, could plausibly have come at a cost measured not in decades of gradual joint wear, but in something far more immediate and consequential for reproduction itself, a trade-off evolution would have little reason to accept, even if it meaningfully reduced knee-related vulnerability later in life. None of these three explanations excludes the others, and most researchers working carefully in this particular area treat them as potentially complementary rather than strictly competing, several separate pressures operating together across an enormous span of evolutionary time rather than one single decisive cause. There is also a simpler possibility worth naming honestly alongside these more detailed explanations, one that requires no elaborate trade-off at all. The particular combination of pressures now bearing down on this joint in large parts of the world today, extended lifespans reaching well past what was typical for most of this evolutionary story, reduced daily movement compared to the sustained distances already described earlier, and increased body weight in some populations represents a genuinely recent set of conditions on the timescale this entire story has been operating within, conditions evolution has simply not had comparable time to respond to in the way it responded to earlier pressures deep in this same story. What all of this leaves behind is not a tidy answer, but a genuinely open one, several plausible, partially overlapping explanations, rather than a single confirmed cause, each shedding some real light on the question while none closing it completely. What connects all of them, though, is a detail easy to miss amid the competing explanations themselves, the recurring suggestion that time itself, whether measured across a single lifetime or across the full span of evolutionary history, sits at the very center of why this particular vulnerability exists in the form it does. Both the reproductive timing explanation and the more recent shift toward longer lifespans point toward the same underlying idea from slightly different angles, that this joint's limitations become most apparent only once a body has been asked to keep functioning for longer than earlier stages of this evolutionary story typically required. That raises a further, genuinely important question this story has not yet directly addressed, about how unusual it actually is, among land animals generally, for any single body to remain alive and moving long enough for this particular kind of slow, cumulative joint wear to become visible at all, a thread this story has not yet pulled all the way through. Picture two very different timelines laid side by side, one belonging to a wild animal moving through open country, alert, watchful, its days shaped by the constant possibility of sudden danger, the other belonging to an ordinary human life stretching gradually across many decades, marked less by at least single dramatic threat than by slow, cumulative change accumulating quietly year after year. And notice how differently each one is likely to end long before any question of a slowly wearing joint ever becomes the deciding factor. In most wild settings, a four-legged animal's entire life is shaped far more by predation, disease, injury, or simple scarcity of food than by the gradual, decades-long process already described earlier in this story, a process that requires an enormous amount of accumulated time to progress from early wear to something seriously limiting. This is not a claim that wild animals never experience joint-related decline at all, since the same basic biology already discussed at length, cartilage without a strong blood supply, tissue slow to repair itself once genuinely damaged, applies broadly across land animals sharing a similar underlying joint structure regardless of species. It is instead a claim about timing, specifically about whether a given individual typically survives long enough within its own natural environment for that slow underlying process to ever become the dominant story of its final years, rather than being cut short by one of the many other pressures already shaping survival in the wild well before that point. Evidence for this distinction shows up clearly and repeatedly whenever the same species, or closely related species, is observed carefully across very different circumstances, protected versus unprotected, captive versus wild, safe versus exposed to the ordinary pressures of survival outdoors. Large domesticated dogs, protected from most of the pressures facing their wild counterparts, regularly live long enough to develop visible, sometimes serious joint-related decline in their later years, a pattern veterinarians see often enough that it forms a routine part of caring for aging animals of this kind. Animals living in zoos or wildlife sanctuaries, similarly shielded from predation, disease, and food scarcity across a full natural lifespan, frequently show comparable signs of joint wear as they age, evidence recorded by the people caring for them directly. Wild populations of the very same or closely related species, by contrast, rarely show this same pattern to nearly the same degree, not because their joints are somehow built differently or inherently more resistant to wear, but simply because relatively few individuals in the wild ever survive long enough for that wear to accumulate into something visible before some other cause of death intervenes first. Among land animals that do tend to survive into genuine old age even in wild conditions, elephants offer a particularly telling comparison, since individuals fortunate enough to reach the final years of a long natural lifespan frequently show visible, sometimes severe wear in the joints of their legs and feet, a well-documented pattern among researchers who study elephant populations across their full lifespan. This matters precisely because it demonstrates clearly that the underlying vulnerability is not something limited to bodies balanced on two legs specifically, but a broader feature of how joints under sustained, repeated mechanical load tend to behave once any individual survives long enough for that cumulative process to run its full course, regardless of how many legs that individual happens to stand on. The underlying vulnerability appears, then, to be broadly shared across land animals carrying weight through comparable joints over a long enough span of time. What differs sharply between species, and even between populations of the very same species living under different conditions, is simply how often a body actually survives long enough for that shared vulnerability to become the deciding factor in how a life eventually unfolds. Humans occupy an unusual position within this broader pattern, one worth examining honestly rather than assuming without real evidence, since the difference between a wild animal's typical life course and an ordinary human one is not simply a matter of danger or safety in the abstract, but a very concrete difference in how much total time a body is actually given to keep using the same joints day after day, long after those joints first began quietly accumulating wear. Compared to most other mammals of similar body size, and even compared to closely related living apes, humans tend to experience an unusually extended period of life, continuing well past the years most directly tied to reproduction, a pattern some researchers connect to the value older, experienced individuals provided within social groups through accumulated knowledge, continued contribution to gathering or preparing food, America, and direct care for grandchildren, sometimes discussed under the general idea that survival well past reproductive years carried genuine benefits for the wider group rather than serving no evolutionary purpose once direct reproduction ended. This pattern stands out as genuinely unusual when placed alongside the broader mammalian world. Among the vast majority of mammal species, female reproductive capacity continues, at some reduced level, across nearly the entire remaining natural lifespan, with very little time typically spent alive, well beyond the point where reproduction becomes biologically unlikely. A complete, extended stop to reproduction occurring well before the natural end of life, followed by many further years of continued activity and social participation, is documented in only a small handful of other species, most notably certain long-lived whales studied specifically because researchers noticed this same unusual pattern recurring in their populations. Human biology fits this same rare category, a genuinely uncommon arrangement among mammals broadly, one that only makes evolutionary sense if those additional years of life, no longer devoted directly to producing new offspring, provided real value to the survival and success of already existing children and grandchildren within the same social group. This extended lifespan is not something that appeared only recently either. Skeletal evidence recovered from populations living well before written history consistently includes individuals who lived into what would now be considered genuine older age, correcting a common misconception worth addressing directly, the idea that people living deep in this evolutionary story routinely died still young by any standard, an idea repeated often enough in popular imagination that it has come to feel like settled fact rather than the oversimplification researchers studying this period generally regard it as. Overall life expectancy, calculated across an entire ancient population, was often pulled down substantially by high mortality during infancy and early childhood, a genuinely difficult period for survival across most of this story, when illness, injury, and limited resources placed real, well-documented pressure on the very youngest members of any group. An individual who survived those earliest, most dangerous years, however, had real odds of living into what would today be considered a mature or even elderly stage of adulthood, sometimes for several further decades beyond that point, a distinction easily lost when a single average life expectancy figure is quoted without explaining how heavily early mortality skews that number downward. Read this way, the honest picture is not a population uniformly cut short in youth, but one shaped heavily by early mortality risk, alongside a meaningful proportion of individuals who, having survived early life, went on to experience a genuinely long remaining lifespan, more than sufficient time for the slow, cumulative process already described in detail earlier in this story to progress from early wear towards something noticeably limiting. Multiple overlapping generations living and moving through the same social group at once, rather than one generation replacing the previous one in quick succession, appears to have been a real and fairly consistent feature of human social life, reaching back a considerable distance into this same evolutionary story, unlike the social structure typical of many other primate species, where fewer individuals tend to survive long enough to overlap with multiple younger generations simultaneously. In a group structured this way, it would not have been unusual for a single community to include young children, their parents, and their grandparents all present and active at the same time, each generation moving through daily life together rather than in separate, non-overlapping stretches of time. A social structure like this, built around individuals routinely surviving well past their reproductive years and remaining active, mobile participants within their communities, is precisely the kind of context in which a slow, decades-long process affecting a heavily used joint would have real opportunity to progress from an early, barely noticeable stage towards something seriously limiting, simply because enough individuals were actually living long enough and remaining active enough for that timeline to reasonably play out. Within a group like this, an older individual's continued mobility likely mattered directly to the group's overall well-being, since contributing to gathering food, sharing accumulated knowledge, or helping care for the youngest members generally required remaining physically capable of moving, walking, and carrying weight across meaningful distances rather than remaining still, meaning the very joint already described as bearing this particular burden was also, quietly, one of the structures most directly tied to whether an older individual could continue contributing meaningfully to the group around them. This raises a further question worth sitting with directly. If the underlying vulnerability inside this particular joint traces back to the basic mechanical arrangement already described, weight passing through a single leg alone with each stride, a joint managing both bend and rotation without a partner limb to share the burden, it becomes worth asking whether this same vulnerability is something every animal that walks upright on two legs must necessarily share, or whether it reflects something more specific to the particular structural solution the human body happened to settle on along its own path toward upright movement. Humans are not, after all, the only creatures that spend at least part of their lives balanced primarily on two limbs rather than four. Birds walk and run on two legs across the entire span of their lives, and certain mammals move almost exclusively by hopping on a pair of powerful hind limbs, rather than walking a conventional stride at all, each representing an entirely different structural answer to roughly the same underlying challenge, supporting a body's full weight through a reduced number of points of contact with the ground. Whether these very different bipedal or near bipedal designs share anything meaningful with the particular vulnerability already described in such detail throughout this story, or whether each one solved the same basic challenge in a way that avoided this specific weakness entirely, is a comparison this story has not yet made, and one worth making directly before concluding that a solo twisting, slow healing knee joint was ever the only reasonable way to walk upright on two legs in the first place. Picture a bird crossing a patch of open ground on foot, its head bobbing slightly with each step, small clawed feet touching down and lifting again in quick succession, legs moving in a quick, springy rhythm that looks almost nothing like the slower, heavier stride already described at length throughout this story, and consider that this animal too is walking upright on two legs, supporting its full weight through a reduced number of points of contact with the ground in fundamentally the same basic sense a human body does. What that bird's leg actually looks like beneath its layer of feathers, however, differs from the human arrangement in a way easy to miss simply by watching it move quickly across open ground. The joint most people would instinctively point to as a bird's knee at first glance, the one that appears to bend backward partway down the leg, is not the true knee at all, but the ankle, positioned unusually low and visible precisely because the actual knee sits tucked high up against the body, hidden almost entirely beneath feathers and close against the trunk, rather than hanging exposed partway down a long, freely swinging limb the way it does in the human arrangement already described in such detail earlier in this story. This placement traces back directly to the environment birds evolved to move through long before most modern species existed in anything like their current form, a lineage descended from earlier bipedal ancestors already adapted for a very different combination of demands: rapid, energy-efficient movement on the ground alongside the entirely separate mechanical requirements of flight, pressures that favoured keeping heavier structures, muscle in particular, concentrated close to the body's centre of mass rather than distributed further out along the limb. Long before flight itself ever entered the picture at all, the deeper ancestors of modern birds were already walking upright on two hind limbs, a lineage of bipedal reptiles whose leg structure had already begun favouring a compact, spring-loaded arrangement well suited to fast, efficient movement across open ground, an arrangement flight later built upon rather than replaced entirely, meaning the leg architecture visible in a bird crossing open ground today carries forward a solution to upright movement shaped initially by an entirely different environment and an entirely different set of pressures than the ones already described shaping the human leg throughout this story. Concentrating muscle near the trunk and relying instead on long, slender tendons running down toward the foot, tendons doing much of the actual mechanical work far from where the true knee itself sits hidden close to the body, produced a leg that functions less like the single hinge and rotation system already described in the human body, and more like a compact spring anchored close to the body, absorbing and returning energy efficiently with comparatively little of the twisting, sideways demand placed on a joint positioned much further from the body's centre of balance. The true knee in a bird's leg, sitting this close against the trunk, never has to manage quite the same isolated balancing act already described as falling entirely on the human knee, since so much of the joint's usual burden is instead handled by tendon and by a leg architecture built around proximity to the body's own centre of gravity rather than distance from it. A very different environmental history, shaped by open, dry landscapes rather than dense forest or dependence on flight, produced an equally different structural answer among certain hopping mammals native to open, dry landscapes, whose typical daily movement across open, often arid grassland relies not on an alternating stride at all, but on both hind legs launching and landing together in near-perfect unison, functioning less like two independent limbs taking turns bearing weight, and more like a single unified spring mechanism working as one coordinated system. This synchronized hopping gait avoids the particular vulnerability already discussed at such length throughout this story almost entirely, since there is no equivalent moment where one leg alone must suddenly bear the body's full weight, while a partner limb hangs uselessly in the air nearby, no isolated joint left forced to manage bend, rotation, and sideways stability all at once without any second limb sharing that same burden in that same critical instant. Instead, both legs load and unload together in rhythm, distributing the mechanical demand of each landing symmetrically across the whole hind limb system rather than concentrating it into one leg working in isolation. The tendons responsible for storing and releasing energy during this synchronized hopping motion are remarkably efficient at their task, efficient enough that covering ground this way can actually become less metabolically costly as speed increases, up to a point. A genuine contrast with the way muscle-powered movement in most other animals, including the human body already described throughout this story, tends to grow steadily more energetically expensive the faster it goes. This creates an interesting contrast with the particular paradox already identified earlier in this story, where greater efficiency in ordinary human movement translated directly into covering far more cumulative distance across a lifetime, and therefore accumulating far more total loading cycles on a single, isolated joint working largely alone. A hopping system built around two synchronized limbs and an unusually efficient elastic tendon does not face quite the same underlying trade-off in the same way, since the efficiency gained here does not concentrate additional stress onto one vulnerable joint working alone the way it consistently does in the human case, precisely because no single joint anywhere in this particular system is ever asked to bear that particular kind of isolated, unshared burden in the first place. A long muscular tail adds a further structural advantage entirely absent from the human arrangement, serving as an additional point of contact during standing and slower movement, effectively providing something close to a third leg capable of helping bear and balance weight, a stabilizing option no version of the human body with its two legs and two free hands has ever had available to it. Where the human knee already described throughout this story must handle sideways stability entirely through its own internal fibrous bands, with no outside structure ever available to share that particular burden, an animal capable of pressing a strong, muscular tail firmly against the ground during moments of slower movement or standing still, effectively distributes at least part of that same stabilizing demand outward to an entirely different body part altogether, one never required to bend, rotate, or absorb repeated impact the way a true leg joint must. Considered alongside the columnar, straight-legged design already noted in passing in the previous stretch of this story, where an enormous body's weight travels down through legs built more like architectural supporting pillars than flexible bending limbs, minimizing muscular effort and joint rotation at the cost of overall agility, these examples together paint a fairly clear picture. This columnar arrangement fits closely with another detail about how such large, heavy-bodied animals actually spend their time across an ordinary day, since a body this heavy tends to remain standing for the great majority of each day and night, resting upright rather than lying fully down for extended stretches the way many smaller animals routinely do, meaning the legs supporting that weight function almost continuously as static, load-bearing columns rather than alternating regularly between active movement and complete rest, the way the human leg already described throughout this story typically does. A structure built primarily to bear weight in this steady, continuous, largely static way over so many years favors straight, thick, minimally jointed columns over the kind of flexible, actively rotating joint the human knee represents, a genuinely different solution shaped by a genuinely different combination of body size and typical daily behavior. There is no single universal solution that every animal supporting weight through a reduced number of limbs was ever forced to adopt. Different environments, different ancestral starting points, and different combinations of pressures around speed, efficiency, agility, and raw body size each produced a genuinely different structural answer to a broadly similar underlying mechanical challenge, some concentrating mass close to the body, some synchronizing paired limbs into a single spring system, some simply building thick, straight columns rather than flexible joints at all, each answer shaped by its own particular history. The particular arrangement already described throughout this story, a body balanced on two legs used in alternation, each one required to manage bend, rotation, and sideways stability entirely alone with no synchronized partner and no tail or trunk to lean on, stands out clearly against this broader comparison as one specific structural choice among several genuinely different ones available in principle, rather than the only conceivable way any animal could ever have solved the challenge of moving upright on a reduced number of limbs. None of these alternative arrangements described here is presented as simply better than the human one in some absolute sense, since each carries its own trade-offs entirely outside the scope of this particular question. Birds sacrifice significant strength and load capacity for lightness suited to flight. Hopping mammals sacrifice the kind of fine-grained, variable stride length and directional flexibility a walking gait allows, and animals built around thick, columnar legs sacrifice speed and agility almost entirely, each solution well suited to its own particular environment and its own particular way of life, and poorly suited to almost any other. The comparison here is narrower and more specific than a simple ranking of which overall body plan happens to be best. It concerns only this one particular vulnerability, the isolated, unshared burden already placed on a single knee joint with every human stride, and whether that specific burden was ever a necessary, unavoidable feature of moving upright on two legs at all, under any circumstances, or something closer to one contingent outcome among several genuinely different structural paths available in principle. Set against birds, against hopping mammals, against animals built around straight, columnar support, the honest answer that emerges appears to be no. This particular combination of solo loading, internal rotation, and limited outside stabilization was not inevitable, but one specific structural path among several genuinely different ones. A body moving on a reduced number of limbs could plausibly have taken instead. Whether this particular structural choice, whatever combination of ancestral starting points and environmental pressures actually produced it deep in this same evolutionary story, left a physical mark on the bones of the individuals who lived through it, a mark that might be visible directly by comparing recovered human remains against the remains of other primates facing rather different mechanical demands of their own, is a comparison this story has laid the groundwork for, but has not yet actually made. Picture two knee joints laid out carefully side by side under the same steady, even light, recovered from two very different skeletons, one belonging to a lineage that walked upright on two legs for the entire span of its adult life, the other belonging to a close relative that spent much of its own life moving through trees and across the ground on all four limbs, both specimens estimated, as carefully as available evidence allows, to have come from individuals who had reached a genuinely advanced age before death. This is the comparison the previous stretch of this story pointed toward without yet making directly, not simply confirming that a joint bore weight in a particular way, but asking what that joint's own surface can reveal, decades after the individual who carried it has died, once placed next to another joint that carried weight through a meaningfully different arrangement across a comparably long life spent moving through an entirely different physical world. Researchers who study this kind of comparative evidence look for specific, recognizable signs directly on the bone itself, changes at the joint surface where cartilage once sat and cushioned every movement, areas that have become unusually smooth or polished from prolonged, direct bone-on-bone contact after cartilage has thinned or worn away entirely, and small, rough outgrowths of new bone forming gradually along the joint's outer edges, a response the body sometimes produces around a joint under sustained mechanical stress, often referred to informally as a kind of bony spur growing out from the margin of the affected surface over time. Neither individual sign proves anything definitive entirely on its own, since both can result from more than one underlying cause acting together, but their combined frequency and severity across a properly matched set of specimens can still offer real, cautious evidence about how differently two related lineages' joints tend to age under differing mechanical demands over time. Alongside these surface signs, some researchers also examine the internal structure of the bone itself, immediately beneath the joint surface, since bone subjected to consistent, repeated mechanical stress over many years tends to become denser and more thickened directly under the specific area receiving that stress, a response distinct from the surface wear already described, but broadly consistent with it, offering a second, semi-independent line of evidence pointing toward how heavily and how consistently a particular joint was loaded across the entire lifetime of the individual it once belonged to. Where these two lines of evidence, surface wear and underlying bone density, happen to point in the same general direction within a given specimen, researchers tend to treat the overall picture emerging from that specimen as considerably more reliable than either individual sign, considered entirely on its own, without corroboration from the other. When researchers have compared specimens matched as closely as possible for estimated age at death, a pattern reported with some real consistency is that these particular signs of joint surface change tend to appear more frequently, and in some cases more severely, in human skeletal remains than in the remains of closely related apes reaching a broadly similar, comparably advanced stage of life. This finding should be stated carefully rather than treated as a settled universal law, since it rests on comparisons drawn from a genuinely limited number of well-preserved, reliably aged specimens on both sides of the comparison, gathered from different sites, different institutions, and different periods of research, and different research teams working with different specimen collections and slightly different methods have not always reported identical patterns down to every last detail. Still, taken together, the general direction of this evidence lines up closely with everything already established mechanically earlier in this story. A joint managing bend, rotation, and sideways stability entirely alone, without a partner limb sharing the load at any point, appears, on the physical evidence currently available, to show more signs of accumulated wear over a comparable span of years than a joint whose owner distributed that same basic mechanical challenge differently across four limbs working together throughout life. Real limitations sit underneath this comparison, and honesty about them matters more here, at this particular point in the story, than almost anywhere else this story has gone so far. Determining the precise age at death of any skeletal specimen, whether human or ape, is itself an estimate built from several different lines of evidence, none of them perfectly precise on their own, meaning any comparison built on matching specimens by estimated age carries some built-in uncertainty of its own, before the joint surfaces themselves are even examined directly by a researcher. Researchers typically rely on a combination of several indicators to reach this kind of estimate, including how completely certain bones have finished growing and fusing, changes in the texture of specific joint surfaces known to shift in fairly predictable ways across an ordinary lifetime, and, where dental remains happen to survive alongside the rest of the skeleton, the degree of wear visible on the teeth themselves, each indicator offering a useful but imperfect clue rather than an exact figure, meaning any single specimen's estimated age typically carries a meaningful margin of uncertainty around it, rather than a precise, confidently known number. Wild apes that survive into genuinely advanced old age are, as already discussed earlier in this same story, comparatively rare to begin with, meaning the pool of well-preserved ape specimens old enough to serve as a genuinely fair comparison point remains smaller than researchers would ideally prefer, a limitation that applies with real force to this particular question. Human skeletal collections available for this kind of study also tend to be considerably larger and more thoroughly catalogued than comparable ape collections, gathered over many decades of dedicated archaeological and anatomical work, an imbalance shaped largely by history and access rather than by anything about the underlying biology itself, and one that could plausibly bias how confidently patterns are reported on either side of the comparison, since a larger, more thoroughly studied collection naturally offers more opportunity to identify and document subtle patterns than a smaller, less extensively examined one ever could. There is a further complication worth stating plainly, and taking seriously rather than setting aside. Even when specimens are matched reasonably well by estimated age, the two lineages being compared did not live identical lives in every other respect, differing not only in how weight passed through the knee joint specifically, but potentially in overall activity level, terrain, available diet, and countless other factors that could each independently influence how a joint ages over the course of a long life, making it genuinely difficult to isolate the specific structural arrangement of the knee as the sole explanation for any difference observed, rather than treating it as one contributing factor among several operating together at once. Researchers attempting to address this difficulty as carefully as the evidence allows sometimes turn to a broader comparison across several different species at once rather than relying on any single pair of specimens, looking for whether the same general pattern, more surface wear, and more internal bone density, change in joints, carrying weight through a single limb at a time, holds consistently across multiple different lineages facing this same basic mechanical arrangement, rather than appearing in only one isolated case that might reflect something unique to that particular pair of specimens rather than the underlying mechanical principle itself. A pattern that recurs consistently across several independent comparisons, even where each individual comparison carries its own uncertainty, generally earns more confidence among researchers than a single striking example considered entirely in isolation, a standard of evidence this particular question has not yet been fully tested against given how limited well-preserved specimens from multiple relevant lineages currently remain available for careful, direct study. Researchers working carefully in this area generally acknowledge this complexity directly rather than presenting their findings as a single, clean, fully isolated cause and effect relationship, preferring instead to describe what the evidence suggests, while naming openly what it cannot yet fully confirm. This kind of careful, hedged reporting is not a weakness in the underlying research at all, but a genuine strength of it, a clear sign that the researchers conducting these careful comparisons understand the real constraints of working with a small, imperfect, unevenly preserved sample of physical evidence reaching back across an enormous span of time, and would rather offer a cautious, honestly qualified conclusion than a confident-sounding claim the evidence cannot actually support. What the evidence currently supports, stated with appropriate caution, is a real and recurring pattern, joints structured the way the human knee is structured, carrying weight through a single limb alone with each stride, appear more prone to visible surface wear over a comparable lifespan than joints belonging to close relatives whose weight moves through a meaningfully different mechanical arrangement, a pattern consistent with, though not fully proven by, everything this story has already laid out about mechanics, terrain, tissue biology, lifetime accumulation, and unusual longevity. What remains less settled, and genuinely worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over, is how much of this difference traces specifically to the isolated, unshared loading pattern already described in such detail, and how much might trace instead to other factors layered alongside it, factors this particular kind of comparative bone evidence alone cannot fully separate from one another. One such factor deserves direct and careful attention here. Since it has been mentioned only briefly in passing so far, despite sitting close to the very center of everything, this story is established about accumulated mechanical loading over a lifetime. Every calculation offered earlier in this story regarding lifetime footfalls and accumulated stride count assumed, implicitly and without stating it directly, a single, fixed amount of weight passing through the knee with each individual step, when in reality the actual force delivered to that joint scales directly with how much the body positioned above it weighs at any given moment in time, meaning two individuals taking the exact same number of steps across the exact same number of years could nonetheless place meaningfully different total mechanical demand on their own knees over a lifetime if their body weight differed from one another in any consistent way. This raises a genuinely important question this story has not yet directly addressed, about how body size and body weight themselves factor into this same accumulated equation, a variable sitting quietly alongside distance and time, easy to overlook precisely because it changes so gradually and so continuously across an ordinary lifetime, rather than announcing itself the way a single dramatic event might. Stand still for a moment, quietly, and feel the weight of an ordinary body settle evenly, calmly, through both legs at once without any particular effort involved, then shift that same weight fully onto one leg alone, the way it happens naturally and repeatedly, with every single stride already described throughout this story. And notice that the sensation in the knee does not simply feel like carrying one's own body weight. It feels like carrying something considerably heavier than that, a sensation with a real, measurable mechanical explanation behind it, rather than mere impression or exaggeration. The actual force traveling through the knee joint during an ordinary step is not simply equal to body weight resting passively on top of it, the way weight might rest quietly on a stationary platform with nothing else happening around it. It also includes the force generated by the muscles surrounding the joint, contracting in that same instant to control the leg's motion, absorb the impact of the foot meeting the ground, and keep the entire body from buckling or collapsing sideways during the exact single leg support phase already described at such length earlier in this story. Because these muscles pull across the joint through relatively short lever arms compared to the much longer lever arm formed by the leg and body positioned above it, the force those same muscles must generate to control movement and absorb impact ends up considerably larger than body weight itself. And since that muscular force also passes directly through the same joint, the muscles are simultaneously working to stabilize and protect. The true total load traveling through the knee with each ordinary step adds up to something meaningfully greater than simple body weight alone, often several times greater during ordinary walking and considerably more during activities involving faster movement, sudden direction changes, or descending a slope or a set of stairs. Descending stairs in particular places an unusually demanding version of this same amplified force squarely onto the knee, since the leg absorbing each downward step must actively control and slow the body's entire descent against gravity, rather than simply supporting steady, stationary weight the way standing still requires, requiring the surrounding muscles to work considerably harder in that instant than they would during level, ordinary walking across flat ground, and delivering a correspondingly larger total force through the joint with every single downward step taken, one after another, all the way down. This detail matters enormously for the arithmetic already laid out earlier in this story, since it means the accumulated lifetime total already described in such careful detail, tens of millions of individual footfalls multiplied by years upon years of sustained daily movement, was never simply a count of ordinary body weight repeated that many times over, but a count of this larger, considerably amplified force repeated that same enormous number of times across an entire lifetime, a genuinely heavier cumulative burden than a first glance at simple body weight alone would ever suggest to someone unfamiliar with how joint mechanics actually work in practice. It also means that even a modest, ordinary change in body weight, the kind that might seem entirely unremarkable when noticed on its own, does not translate into an equally modest change in the force actually reaching the knee, since whatever additional weight a body carries gets multiplied by this same amplifying effect with every single stride taken while carrying it, meaning a relatively small shift in body weight can translate into a considerably larger shift in the total mechanical demand placed on the joint across an entire day of ordinary movement, and further still across months or years of accumulated movement carried out under that same shifted weight. Few circumstances illustrate this particular amplification more clearly or more universally across ordinary human experience than pregnancy, a period during which body weight increases meaningfully and steadily over the course of many months, weight carried not briefly or occasionally the way a heavy bag might be set down after use, but continuously across nearly every waking hour of daily movement for the better part of a year. This added weight does not distribute itself evenly across the whole body the way ordinary weight gain elsewhere on the body might, since it concentrates specifically toward the front of the torso, shifting the body's overall center of gravity forward and requiring real, continuous postural adjustment simply to remain balanced while standing, walking, or climbing a set of stairs, adjustments that themselves place additional demand on the muscles already responsible for stabilizing the knee during single leg support. A body compensating for this forward shift in weight often adopts a slightly different overall posture through the lower back and hips during these months, leaning back somewhat to keep the center of gravity positioned above the feet rather than pulled forward and threatening balance, a compensation that changes not only how the back and hips experience daily movement, but also how weight and force ultimately travel downward, through the leg and into the knee, with each individual step taken across these same months. The pelvis, already discussed earlier in this story as carrying its own significant competing demands tied to both upright walking and the shape of the birth canal, also undergoes real structural change during this same period, becoming somewhat more flexible in preparation for eventual childbirth, a shift that can itself alter how weight and force travel downward through the hip and into the knee below it during ordinary daily movement across these months. This particular structural change reinforces something already touched on carefully earlier in this story, that the pelvis sits at a genuine intersection of several competing demands at once: upright locomotion, childbirth, and now, temporarily, an additional layer of postural adjustment layered on top of both of these existing pressures, all converging on a relatively narrow region of the skeleton, positioned directly above the very joint. This entire story has focused on so closely, from its opening moment onward. None of this suggests anything has gone wrong or malfunctioned during this particular period of life, since these changes represent an ordinary, expected part of a demanding but entirely normal biological process central to how this same story continues faithfully across countless successive generations. But the combination of added weight, shifted center of gravity, and altered pelvic mechanics does mean the knee's already considerable ordinary workload temporarily increases further during these months, a real, if usually temporary, addition to the cumulative lifetime total already described throughout this story. The added weight carried during pregnancy is not the only extra weight many human bodies carry across a lifetime either. Human infancy, already discussed earlier in this story as unusually long and unusually helpless, compared to the infancy of most other animals sharing this same broad evolutionary lineage, requires an infant to be physically carried by another body for a considerable portion of its earliest months and years. Weight added not to the body of the infant itself, but to the body of whoever carries it, often repeatedly, across countless individual instances of lifting, holding, and walking while bearing that additional weight. This particular demand traces back directly to the same deep evolutionary story already told carefully throughout these pages, since an infant born this helpless, unable to cling, walk, or move independently the way infants of many other primate species can manage within days or weeks of their own birth, depends entirely on being carried by another body for transportation across almost any meaningful distance during its earliest stage of life. A dependence lasting considerably longer in humans than in most closely related species sharing a broadly similar body plan, across many different human societies studied carefully by researchers, and likely across a considerable stretch of this same evolutionary story, reaching well back before written history ever began. Carrying an infant or young child during ordinary daily movement, walking to gather food, moving camp from one location to another, travelling between distant water sources appears to have been a routine, near constant feature of daily life for whoever held primary responsibility for that particular child, adding meaningful extra weight to the body doing the carrying across countless individual steps taken during exactly the kind of sustained, long-distance movement already described at such great length earlier in this story. Across an individual life, and especially across a life spent caring for more than one child in close succession over many consecutive years, this kind of intermittent, repeated extra loading adds up steadily to its own meaningful contribution to the total cumulative demand already placed on the knee by ordinary movement alone, a contribution easy to overlook precisely because it arrives in scattered everyday moments. Carrying a child up a set of stairs, lifting a child up from the ground, walking while holding a child's weight balanced against one hip, rather than announcing itself as a single, dramatic event worth separate notice or comment. Taken together, these additional sources of weight, temporary during pregnancy, intermittent during the years spent caring for young children, layer directly onto the already considerable baseline demand. This story has spent so much time describing, a reminder that the total lifetime burden carried by this one joint was never simply a matter of steps and years considered in isolation, but steps and years combined with a body weight that itself shifted, sometimes considerably, across the very same span of time. This story has followed from a single stride to an entire accumulated lifetime. This raises a further question worth asking honestly, one this story has not yet directly confronted despite everything already established about the shared mechanical vulnerability sitting at the very centre of this joint. If body weight itself varies so meaningfully across a lifetime, sometimes gradually and sometimes in concentrated bursts tied to specific life stages, and if the underlying mechanical vulnerability already described applies broadly across bodies built this way, why do two individuals facing what looks, from the outside, like a genuinely similar combination of weight, movement, and years, so often end up with such visibly different outcomes by the time old age actually arrives, one person moving easily and comfortably through their later decades while another, seemingly carrying a broadly comparable history of steps and weight, experiences far more noticeable difficulty getting around. Everything laid out so carefully so far across this entire story has described what is broadly shared across bodies, built this same basic way, generation after generation, life after life. It has not yet asked what might differ between one individual body and the next, a question this shared mechanical story alone cannot fully answer. Picture two people, both well into their later decades, both having spent a broadly comparable number of years walking, working, and carrying the ordinary weight of daily life already described throughout this story, standing side by side at the base of a short flight of stairs on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. One climbs without any particular hesitation, movement fluid, weight shifting easily and confidently from one leg to the next, largely unremarkable to anyone watching closely. The other pauses first, weight shifting carefully, one hand finding the railing before the first step is even attempted, a visible caution entirely absent from the person standing beside them. Nothing about the mechanical story already told throughout this entire account explains this particular difference on its own, since both bodies share the same basic joint architecture, the same hinge and rotation arrangement, the same limited healing tissue, the same accumulated decades of footfalls already counted so carefully earlier in this story. The explanation for this kind of difference has to be found somewhere this story has not yet looked closely enough. In the space separating what is broadly shared across every body built this same basic way from what varies, sometimes considerably, from one individual body to the next. One source of this variation sits directly in the angle already discussed at length earlier in this story, the inward lean of the thigh bone as it descends from hip to knee, the very feature researchers rely on to identify upright walking in fossilized bone, reaching back deep into this evolutionary story. That angle is not identical across every human body, the way a single fixed measurement stamped uniformly onto every skeleton might be, but varies within a real range from one individual to another, shaped by differences in hip width, leg length, and overall skeletal proportion present from birth, or emerging gradually during growth through childhood and adolescence. A steeper version of this angle places somewhat more sideways stress on the structures already described as responsible for stabilizing the joint. The fibrous bands and cushioning tissue discussed at length earlier in this story, while a shallower version places comparatively less demand on those same structures across an otherwise similar pattern of movement. Neither version represents a malfunction or a mistake in any meaningful sense, since both fall comfortably within the ordinary range of human anatomical variation observed across any sufficiently large and diverse population. But the practical consequence across an entire lifetime of accumulated footfalls can differ meaningfully between someone sitting near one end of this natural range and someone sitting near the other, even when every other circumstance of their two otherwise separate lives runs remarkably parallel from beginning to end. A second source of variation sits lower down, in the arch running along the underside of the foot, already discussed earlier in this story as a passive, energy-returning structure, supporting efficient long-distance movement across generations of sustained walking. The height and stiffness of that arch also varies considerably from person to person, some feet flattening and springing back with pronounced flexibility on every single step, others remaining comparatively rigid throughout the exact same motion, a range of natural variation visible even among people raised in broadly similar environments and following broadly similar patterns of daily activity. A flatter, more flexible arch tends to absorb and redistribute the shock of each footfall somewhat differently than a stiffer, less flexible one does, meaning the exact pattern of force travelling upward from the ground, through the ankle, and into the knee above it, can differ meaningfully between two people walking across the exact same surface for the exact same number of steps across an entire day. Neither pattern is inherently better across every circumstance a person might encounter, since each carries its own trade-offs between shock absorption and mechanical efficiency during propulsion, but the specific combination of angle and arch a given individual happens to be built with can meaningfully shape how much cumulative stress actually reaches the knee across a lifetime of otherwise broadly similar movement carried out day after day. A third source of variation involves the muscles surrounding the joint directly, already discussed earlier in this story as sharing part of the burden of stabilizing the knee during single leg support throughout every ordinary day. The strength, coordination, and endurance of these muscles differ considerably from one individual to another, shaped by some combination of genetic predisposition, activity level maintained across an entire lifetime, and simple chance accumulated along the way, and a body with stronger, better coordinated muscles surrounding the joint is generally able to absorb and control more of the sideways and rotational demand already described directly through active muscular effort, leaving comparatively less of that demand to fall on the joint's own passive, slow-healing internal structures. Where muscular support around the joint remains strong and well coordinated across many decades, some portion of the mechanical burden already described throughout this story shifts away from the vulnerable cartilage and ligament tissue and toward tissue considerably better equipped to handle repeated demand and to recover between one bout of activity and the next. This kind of muscular contribution is not fixed from birth the way skeletal angle largely is, since muscle tissue responds continuously to how it is used across an entire lifetime, strengthening somewhat with regular, sustained activity maintained consistently over years, and weakening somewhat with prolonged inactivity, meaning the degree of protection this particular source of variation actually provides can shift meaningfully within a single individual's own lifetime, rather than remaining constant from one decade to the next in the way inherited skeletal structure does. There is a further layer of variation harder to observe directly and correspondingly harder to speak about with full confidence, involving the cartilage tissue itself. Some evidence suggests that the underlying composition of this tissue, the particular density and arrangement of the fibers holding it together, may differ somewhat between individuals in ways connected to heredity, meaning two people exposed to what looks from the outside like an identical mechanical history could nonetheless be working with tissue, carrying somewhat different baseline durability from the very start. Researchers investigating this possibility generally approach it with real caution, since separating an inherited difference in tissue composition from the countless other factors already discussed throughout this same story — skeletal angle, foot structure, muscular strength, lifetime activity level, ordinary diet, and simple chance accumulated across many decades of ordinary living — remains genuinely difficult using the research tools currently available to anyone studying this question carefully. Family patterns, where joint-related decline appears to run somewhat more commonly through certain family lines than others, offer suggestive evidence worth taking seriously. But family members also tend to share environments, habits, footwear, occupation, and activity patterns alongside whatever genetic material they happen to share, meaning shared family patterns alone cannot cleanly separate inherited tissue composition from inherited lifestyle and circumstance passed down just as readily through habit and example as through biology itself. This particular line of evidence remains considerably less settled than the anatomical variation already described in the skeleton and the muscles surrounding it, resting on a smaller and still actively developing body of research, and should be treated with appropriate caution rather than presented as a fully established explanation on its own. Taken together, these several sources of variation — skeletal angle, foot structure, muscular strength and coordination, and possibly tissue composition itself — help explain why the shared mechanical vulnerability already described throughout this entire story, present in some form within essentially every body, built this same basic way, does not translate into an identical outcome for every individual carrying it, regardless of how similar their years, weight, and daily movement might otherwise appear from the outside. This kind of variation is not itself surprising once placed alongside everything already established about how this particular vulnerability came to exist in the first place. A vulnerability whose worst consequences tend to emerge later in life, well past the years most directly tied to reproduction and early child rearing, faces comparatively weak pressure from natural selection to be resolved with precision across every member of a population, and that same weak pressure leaves considerably more room for ordinary biological variation to persist across a population than would ever be tolerated for a trait more directly and immediately tied to survival or successful reproduction earlier in life. In other words, the very same timing already discussed as one possible explanation for why this joint was never more heavily reinforced across the whole of this evolutionary story may also help explain why the specific severity of its consequences varies so widely from one individual body to the next, since neither uniformity nor optimization was ever strongly demanded by the underlying evolutionary pressures shaping this particular joint across such an enormous span of time. What remains genuinely unresolved, and worth sitting with honestly rather than glossing over, is how much of this individual variation traces to inherited anatomical differences present from birth, and how much traces instead to choices, circumstances, and habits accumulated across a lifetime. A distinction this particular part of the story has not fully untangled, and one that continues to occupy researchers studying this question directly. What this variation does make clear, however, is that the mechanical story already told throughout this entire account was never quite as uniform in its ultimate consequences as it might have first appeared on the surface. A shared vulnerability written broadly into the architecture of every body built this same basic way, but experienced across a genuinely wide range of individual severity depending on the particular combination of angle, arch, muscle, and tissue any given body happened to be built with from the very start of its own life. This same variation raises one further question worth carrying forward carefully into what remains of this story. Everything described so far throughout this account has concerned what the body itself does or does not provide toward managing this shared vulnerability, structure, tissue, and muscle acting largely on their own, without outside help or intervention of any kind. It has not yet asked what happens once a mind capable of noticing this vulnerability, understanding its origins, and deliberately working around it enters the picture directly, a capacity this particular body happens to possess in a form unlike almost any other animal moving on land across the whole of this story. Picture a hand closing firmly around a sturdy length of wood, planting one end firmly against the ground just ahead of a forward step, weight settling into it briefly before the leg beneath finishes its own share of the same motion, and feel, for a moment, what actually changes in that instant. Weight that would otherwise travel entirely through a single leg alone, with no second point of contact anywhere nearby to share that same burden, now has somewhere else to go instead. A third point of support, briefly touching the ground exactly when the leg beneath it, needs that help the most, in exactly the instant already described throughout so much of this story, as the moment of greatest vulnerability. Nothing about the knee joint itself has changed in this particular moment. The same hinge, the same limited allowance for rotation, the same slow healing tissue, already described in such careful detail throughout this entire story, remains exactly, precisely, as it always was before that hand ever reached for the wood at all. What has changed instead is everything around it, a deliberate, external solution layered carefully on top of a body whose own internal architecture was never given anything quite like this directly by the slow, gradual evolutionary process already described so extensively across so much of this story. This is, in its own quiet way, remarkably similar to something already discussed earlier in this same story, a long, muscular tail providing certain hopping animals with an extra point of ground contact. Their two hind legs alone could never manage entirely on their own during moments of standing or slower movement. The crucial difference, worth sitting with directly, is that no evolutionary process needed to slowly grow this particular structure onto the human body across countless generations the way it did for that tail. A mind capable of recognizing the problem clearly and reaching for a solution simply picked one up from the ground nearby without a second thought, and in doing so, created something functionally comparable to that same missing third point of support, without ever needing to wait for biology to provide it directly through the ordinary, gradual mechanism this entire story has spent so long describing. This points towards something genuinely distinct about how this particular story continues from here forward. Everything described throughout this entire account up to this point has unfolded on the timescale of biological evolution, changes to bone, tendon, and tissue accumulating gradually across many thousands of generations, each small adjustment tested and either kept or discarded across an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of time, a pace of change too slow for any single individual living through it to ever perceive directly. A solution like a simple length of wood, reached for once, understood, and then deliberately reached for again the next time a similar need arises, operates on an entirely different timescale altogether, one compressed down potentially to a single lifetime, or even to a single afternoon of noticing a problem and improvising an answer to it on the spot. Once discovered by any single individual, a solution of this kind does not need to wait for gradual selection across generations to become useful to others either, since it can simply be observed, copied, and passed along directly from one person to another within the very same generation, spreading through an entire group far faster than any biological adaptation ever could hope to travel through a This same capacity connects directly to something already established quite carefully earlier in this story, the unusually extended lifespan reaching well past reproductive years, and the resulting presence of multiple overlapping generations living and moving through the same community at once, all sharing space and daily life together across the same stretch of years rather than passing through in quick, non-overlapping succession the way many other species tend to experience their own generational turnover. An older individual whose own knee carried real visible difficulty by this particular stage of life did not necessarily need full unimpaired mobility to remain a genuinely valuable member of that same community, since knowledge, memory, and accumulated experience gathered across a long lifetime could be shared and passed along faithfully through teaching, storytelling, and direct demonstration, regardless of exactly how easily that same individual could still climb, run, or cover long distances entirely on their own two legs the way they once did decades earlier. Sitting still, or moving slowly and carefully with the help of a simple support like the one already described, an older member of a community could still demonstrate how to prepare a particular food, how to recognize a dangerous plant from a similar-looking harmless one, or how a difficult tool was once made, transmitting exactly the kind of accumulated knowledge already discussed earlier in this story, as one plausible reason this unusually extended lifespan proved valuable in the first place. In this sense, the very same social structure already discussed at length as helping explain why this particular vulnerability became visible in the first place, bodies living long enough for slow, cumulative wear to matter and become apparent, may also have helped soften some of its practical consequences over time, not by fixing the joint itself, but by ensuring that a body carrying real difficulty in that joint could still contribute meaningfully to the group around it, in ways that did not depend entirely on unimpaired movement. Honesty about the limits of this particular evidence matters here as much as anywhere else in this story. A simple wooden walking aid, unlike bone or stone, does not survive well across the enormous stretches of time this story has spent moving through page after page. Since wood and other organic materials decay and disappear from the archaeological record far more readily and far more completely than harder, more durable materials like bone or stone ever do, meaning direct physical evidence confirming when this kind of solution first appeared, and how commonly it was actually used across daily life, remains genuinely difficult to establish with real confidence. What can be said with considerably more confidence is that the cognitive capacity required for this kind of solution, recognizing a physical limitation clearly, understanding its underlying cause well enough to address it deliberately, and fashioning or selecting an object specifically to compensate for it, fits comfortably within the broader pattern of tool use and problem solving, already documented extensively elsewhere across this same evolutionary story, in materials that did happen to survive across such an enormous stretch of time. Even where direct evidence for this particular application to this particular joint remains considerably harder to pin down with quite the same confidence available elsewhere. There is a genuine paradox worth naming directly at this point in the story, one that reaches back to something touched on only briefly near its very beginning. The same large capable brain responsible for recognizing this joint's limitation, understanding its underlying mechanical cause, and reaching deliberately for a solution to compensate for it, is itself a product of the exact same long, slow evolutionary process already described so carefully throughout this entire account. A process that also, somewhere along that same long path, left this particular joint with the comparatively modest set of tools already discussed at such length earlier in this story. The very capacity now being used to work around this vulnerability was shaped by the same forces that failed to reinforce the vulnerability itself. A body that solved the problem of thinking its way past a limitation it never quite managed to solve directly through structure alone. This is not a contradiction so much as a genuine asymmetry worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Two very different kinds of solution existing side by side within the very same body, one biological and slow, unfolding across countless thousands of generations, the other cognitive and comparatively fast, capable of unfolding within a single lifetime or even a single afternoon, both emerging from the exact same underlying evolutionary story already traced throughout this entire account, yet arriving at entirely different outcomes when each was applied, in its own way, to this one particular joint. None of this changes anything about the underlying mechanical reality this entire story has spent so much time describing. The joint itself, its hinge, its narrow allowance for rotation, its poorly supplied and slow-healing internal tissue, remains precisely what it always was, unaltered by any tool, any accumulated knowledge, or any social structure built up around it. What intelligence and cooperation actually changed was never the joint itself, but the surrounding context in which that joint's limitations had to be managed, a difference worth sitting with carefully rather than mistaking for a genuine biological solution to a problem. This story began by describing, as fundamentally mechanical in nature, rooted in a single joint's isolated architecture, rather than in anything a tool or a shared piece of knowledge could ever reach directly. A body capable of solving so many external problems across the whole of this evolutionary story, finding food across a shifting, unpredictable landscape, building shelter against wind, rain and cold, forming complex, cooperative societies capable of passing knowledge faithfully across many overlapping generations, living and working side by side, never once managed to solve this particular internal one directly, and instead learned, again and again, across countless individual lives spanning an enormous stretch of time, simply to work around it rather than resolve it at its actual source. Everything this story has traced so carefully so far, the mechanical arrangement first laid out at its very beginning, the shifting terrain of an ancient, unpredictable landscape stretching out beneath an open sky, the slow healing tissue asked to absorb decades upon decades of repeated impact without complaint, the sheer accumulated scale of an entire lifetime spent walking, the unresolved question of why meaningful reinforcement never came despite so much time to develop it, the unusual span of years human bodies are typically given to live compared to so many other creatures, the very different solutions other animals arrived at entirely on their own, the direct physical evidence written quietly into bone itself, the added weight carried during pregnancy and while raising the next generation year after year, the individual variations separating one body's own experience from another's despite outwardly similar lives. And now this final layer of intelligence and cooperation working quietly around a problem it could never quite reach or resolve directly, all of it circles back, in the end, to the exact same joint this story opened by asking about. So return, quietly, to the simple act with which this story began, one foot leaving the ground, the other remaining beneath the body, and the full weight of a human life passing for a moment through a single knee. Four-legged animals are not protected from aging joints, and their cartilage can thin, tear, and deteriorate just as living tissue does elsewhere. But their bodies usually solve the problem of support through a wider frame, more points of contact, and a different distribution of balance. The human knee faces a more unusual combination. It must carry the body alone during part of every stride, guide an inward-angled thigh into a forward-facing foot, allow just enough rotation to keep walking smooth, resist sideways collapse on uncertain ground, and repeat all of this across millions of steps. Inside that joint, the tissue absorbing much of the load has little direct blood supply and only a limited ability to rebuild itself once serious damage begins. Nothing in this arrangement is mysterious when each piece is considered separately. What makes the knee vulnerable is the way all of those pieces meet in one small place over a very long time. Upright walking gave our ancestors something of enormous value. It freed the hands, raised the head, made long-distance travel more efficient, and eventually placed tools, food, children, and shared work within the reach of arms no longer needed for ordinary movement. Yet evolution did not design a joint for permanent use without consequence. It shaped a structure that worked well enough, for long enough, under the pressures that mattered most at the time. The knee was not built as a perfect hinge, and it was not abandoned as a failed one. It was a compromise, flexible enough to walk, stable enough to stand, light enough to swing, and durable enough to carry generation after generation across changing landscapes. The cost of that compromise becomes clearer only because human beings often live for many decades, remain active into later life, and continue asking the same joint to serve long after countless earlier steps have already passed through it. Other animals may reach the same biological limits when they live long enough, especially in protected or domesticated settings. But the human pattern is intensified by the particular mechanics of alternating two-legged walking, and by the unusual length of time for which we continue doing it. And when the joint could not be redesigned quickly enough, another part of the human story responded. A hand found a branch, a community slowed its pace, knowledge replaced some lost strength, and care allowed an older body to remain valuable even when movement became more difficult. Biology supplied no perfect repair, but intelligence and cooperation changed what that imperfection meant. That may be the quiet lesson held inside the knee. The human body is not a collection of flawless solutions. It is a record of workable ones, each carrying traces of the conditions under which it first became useful. Weakness and success can exist in the same structure. The joint that wears with age is also the joint that carried our ancestors out of the trees, across open ground, between distant sources of food and water, and into lives organized around free hands and shared knowledge. So the next time a knee bends beneath an ordinary step, it may help to see more than a fragile hinge wearing down. It is an old, evolutionary bargain still being honored beneath the body, one quiet transfer of weight at a time, carrying within it both the freedom that upright walking made possible and the slow, ordinary cost of keeping that freedom across a lifetime.